G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute.
More than 250,000 people have now died from COVID-19. The human toll has been devastating, particularly in the US.
Just got some breaking news to hand that it's the 16th death at the Newmarch facility. Anglicare has issued this
planning to ramp up testing for COVID-19 to include people with even mild symptoms. The number of new cases remains low.
World leaders have promised more than $12 billion to develop vaccines and trial drugs to fight the coronavirus in a special online
And
summit.
now we go to Down Under, to Australia, with a message from Prime Minister Scott Morrison.
G'day from Australia. We're very pleased to be part of this important event today, and I want to thank the European Commission.
There are more than 100 different groups working on a vaccine.
Europe's first human trial of a coronavirus vaccine is underway.
So there are three aspects to this. One is the vaccine safe? And that's a phase 1 trial where you try on volunteers. Then you go to a phase 2 study.
We need to produce it and to deploy it in every single corner of the world.
And today I'm privileged to bring you some very special guests from our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. Immunologist and Nobel Prize Laureate Professor Peter Doherty and our Chief Economist Richard Dennis. Professor Peter Doherty was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine jointly with Rolf M. Zinkernagel in 1996 for their discoveries concerning the specificity of the cell-mediated immune defence. Professor Doherty is a patron of the Australia Institute, as well as a patron and namesake of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And Dr. Richard Dennis is the Chief Economist at the Australia Institute. He's a former Associate Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU, a prominent economist and public policy intellectual, and author of several books including Econobabble, Affluenza, Curing Affluenza and Dead Right, How Neoliberalism Ate Itself and What Comes Next. This was recorded live on Tuesday the 5th of May 2020 and things may have changed since recording. Professor Peter Doherty, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure.
So first of all, I just wanted to ask you, Australia seems to have done very well in its public health response. How would you summarise where we find ourselves right now?
We're in great shape, and I think excuse me, this is not COVID-19, and we're in great shape, and I think the Prime Minister and the state premiers and the political class in general deserves major congratulations for moving fast on this and moving very effectively. So the shutdown has allowed us time to be ready, and we're much better prepared. And we also hope that we'll be able to keep it at a very low level. Maybe even we'll be luckier than that, but we'll see what happens.
Thank you so much for that. And I guess the other question I wanted to start out with is obviously Australia has had pretty huge success on the public health front, but there's also been very strong criticism, perhaps more recently, of the social distancing measures that we have enacted and a lot of those restrictions. What do you make of those people who are critical of that strong social distancing measures as being over the top?
There have always been 2 points of view on this, that basically we should do what we're doing, which is lock everything down and basically stop transmission, which pretty much is what we've done. We've had some workers still out there. Our meat workers, for instance, we just had an outbreak in a local meat works with 20 people infected. That just happened recently. And also the construction workers have been out there. So we didn't ever lock down to the extent, say, New Zealand did or that Spain did for a time. But there's also been another point of view that says, well, try and protect the old people, who are the people who are highly vulnerable, and just let her rip, because basically most younger people will be okay. Not all, because we know some younger people have died, but most will be okay, and they'll survive, and we'll all get herd immunity much more quickly, and we don't have to destroy our economy and all that sort of thing. So there are 2 arguments out there. The second one certainly hasn't appealed to the medical people very much, and but I'm trained as a vet, Initially we believe in test and slaughter. So I can see where they're coming from. I'm happy we didn't do that. The British tried that strategy, I think. They let her rip and try and protect the old people, but they didn't succeed in protecting the old people. A lot of people have died. Elderly people have died, and they turned to a shutdown strategy. But it's an argument, and I'm very happy to try and deal with contrary views to my own. I think it's just not a very empathetic view, I think.
Richard, we've obviously seen some new figures out today from Treasury about the economic impact of those restrictions. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're starting to see numbers now about, the cost being $4 billion a day. And to be clear, we're heading for the biggest downturn in Australia's recorded history. The 1991 recession led to national income, GDP, falling less than 2%. We've now got the Reserve Bank and Treasury saying that our economy's decline will be around 10%. So, do the maths. This recession is 5 times bigger than the last recession we had, 1991. So the costs are enormous, but I think it's interesting, both the timing and the specificity now. We're seeing what the costs per day are. I don't think that's accidental. I think that's designed to put a bit of pressure on state premiers, saying, look, every day now that we keep the restrictions is a pretty expensive day. Do you really want to wait 2 more weeks? Do you really want to wait 3 more weeks? So, to be clear, the next steps in Australia, I think I'd be interested in Peter's thoughts on this, but I think most experts in epidemiology would agree that, look, the next steps are going to be to loosen restrictions because we've been so effective here in Australia. It's only because we shut down hard. It's only because we've done such a good job of getting it under control that we can meaningfully talk about lifting restrictions. But, that tension of, which restrictions and how quickly, that's yet to be played out. So I don't think it's an accident that we've started to define the costs by the day. I think that's designed to put a bit of pressure on. So I guess my question to you, Peter, is, where do you think we're at? What do you think the next, restrictions to be lifted will be? And I guess the question that everyone's really keen to hear is, should we open our schools or not? That's where let's be clear, politics has always sort of used schools as our ideological stamping ground. We're doing it again. It's familiar territory, but there's a lot of parents out there thinking, well, there's no coronavirus in my community. Maybe my teachers can do a better job than I can.
Okay. I'll respond to Richard. Okay, so, I think that those of us in the medical science community are all acutely aware of both the economic and beyond that, the social cost of shutting down. And we're all keyed into the idea that these restrictions must be lifted. The issue is, of course, and it's a very difficult path for the politicians to negotiate, is how to get out of them safely. So what they've given us is time and resources. There's been a lot of funding supplied federally and from the state and from philanthropists as well, to put in place the testing resource so that we can do large-scale testing. When this began, we could only test very limited numbers of samples. But potentially in Victoria, we could now go to 10,000 a day, which is a very high level of testing. And we may need that if we start to get, as restrictions are lifted, we start to see little flare-ups. We'll need to do contact tracing. We'll need to try and put out the fires, if you like. The worst-case scenario, of course, is as we lift, that we will actually get another major ramp up. And the worst thing that could happen from the point of view of the economy and socially too is have to shut down again. So the point is to stop that happening. We think we can, and we've also got a lot more hospital beds and ventilators. ResMed, the The sleep apnea company, for instance, has been manufacturing ventilators and I think has found new economic opportunities there. So some people have found new economic opportunities through this. But my sense of it, and I'm just talking as an individual because I'm in no way involved in the policy decisions on this. Our institute's policy involvement is through our epidemiology team, largely led by Jodie McVernon, that feeds up into the key committees that advise the chief medical officer and thus the cabinet that Scott Morrison put together and the Prime Minister, of course. So we have that involvement, but I've got no policy role. My sense is that the infection has been very successfully damped down in South Australia, probably Western Australia and the Northern Territory. So one would think it might make sense to have them a bit ahead of the game as we lift restrictions and maybe not do it en bloc right across the country. The two cities I think that are great at risk are Melbourne and Sydney because of their large populations and because they've had more cases. But our sense in Melbourne is that the background infection rate is very low. And so, of course, we'll see where it goes. And, you know, I think it's perfectly acceptable for the premiers to take different lines on this. It gives us a number of different experiments, and I'm an experimentalist, so I'm all for experiments. I'm greatly interested in watching the Americans experiment, where they're going to lift restrictions in the face of escalating case numbers. I think that will be catastrophic in some states. I think they're thinking they can lift them in rural areas, not in the cities. My sense of that is the guys in the cities will jump in their car and head out to a pub or a restaurant in a rural area, so I don't think it's going to work. The schools are a very complex issue because they're not homogeneous. They're, you've got little kids and you've got older kids, and the older ones are really young adults, and so I've tended to stay away from the whole argument. Our epidemiologist, Jodie McVernon, seems reasonably satisfied that it is safe to open schools, but Dan Andrews is not going with that yet. I mean, the schools have always been partly open for those kids who need, public schools at least, for those kids who don't have internet access or need support, or they're the children of healthcare workers or something like that. So complicated issues, some of which are considerably above both my level of insight and pay grade, and I really don't add any more than an ordinary anyone in the community would add.
Thanks for that, Peter. I will just say for those joining us from New South Wales, I myself developed a cough recently and live close to a hotspot in Nowra. Took myself off to get tested and got the swab up my nose, which was a little bit uncomfortable. But because they've expanded the testing here, I think in anticipation of lifting some of those restrictions, and I was told my results would come back within 3 to 5 days, but less than 24 hours later, I got a text message saying I was negative, which was a great relief to me, obviously. But it does look like we have put in place a lot of those preconditions that we would need to be able to start lifting some restrictions. And the Australia Institute actually had some international research out yesterday that looked at attitudes across 6 nations around the world. And New Zealand and Australia actually ranked at the top for both people's trust in government advice and how they rated the government's response. And obviously today, Jacinda Ardern is going to join the National Cabinet, which has never happened before. I think that's unprecedented. Peter, I would just ask you, I guess, why do you think that Australians have and New Zealanders are having such trust in government, which we certainly haven't seen in previous years? And do you think it's possible that we could have a kind of a trans-Tasman bubble, so to speak, that might be being discussed at National Cabinet today? What's your view?
Oh, yeah, we could always discuss moving the Australian National Capital to Wellington. I think it's usually approached the other way around. No, I think we're sort of good friends. And it's like a family, isn't it, really? The New Zealanders see our flaws much more clearly than anybody else does. And we make a lot of jokes about them. But no, it's interesting that we both had similar responses. New Zealand went a bit further. They locked down a bit harder, but from two different, very, very different political cultures. And so it's been gratifying to see that there's still a basic pragmatism in our attitudes and approaches. I was worrying that we were going a bit too much down that sort of libertarian, live free or die American crap. And I lived in America for a long time, so I know how crazy it can get. And it seems we're not. We're still accustomed to the idea that it's the right thing to do to protect our population and our people, and that comes first. And so, it's been good to see. I hope, and it's the one possibility, of course, for opening up international air travel is between us and New Zealand. I should say also that both Australia and New Zealand have been helping the Pacific countries get their testing in place and helping them to prepare. And I think both countries, no matter what the government is, do a good job with the Pacific neighbours in general. Our Navy seems to be largely designed to provide relief material for them when there's a catastrophe. So I think our Anzac spirit is alive and well, and it's great to see that.
So on that, Peter, we're talking about an Australia-New Zealand bubble, which is obviously an obvious place to start, but there seems to be very low prevalence of COVID-19 in most South Pacific countries. Is it possible that after we open up a bubble with New Zealand, that bubble could be extended to some or a majority of the South Pacific island nations, especially if they kind of agree that they won't take international flights from anywhere except Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, one would need to understand the cultures a bit better than I do. But we do have linkages out into them. Our World Health Organization Influenza Centre, collaborating centre, one of 6 worldwide, is located in our institute. And one of the things they do is training in influenza diagnosis and so forth through the Pacific, through this part of the Pacific. And we have a full-time person who does that, and he's been out there talking to them, helping them get this stuff ramped up. So, that's a possibility. The other possibility, of course, is if there's a vaccine out there before too long, once people are vaccinated and maybe even been tested to show they have good antibodies, and I believe that will be protective, then maybe we can open up travel to people who present a vaccination certificate and evidence that they are immune. So there are ways of thinking about opening up travel, and that would certainly be one of them. It's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of it.
I was going to ask next, Peter, and maybe then to you, Richard. There has been a lot of questions and, frankly, a lot of hysteria and fear-mongering around China and the role of China. I wanted to ask you, Peter, do Australian scientists have good relationships with the Chinese scientific community? And how important will those links be at a time like this?
Yes, absolutely. We do have very long-term and extremely good relationships with many people in the scientific community in China. We've done extensive collaboration at the time of the H7, our own group has influenza group, at the time of the H7N9 bird flu scare. This was a virus that, like the H5N1 earlier, went directly from birds to humans, but never really spread in humans. But we did a lot of work with a fantastic group of people at Fudan University in Shanghai. They are wonderful to deal with. We've had people backwards and forwards and highly ethical and scientists, and a pleasure to associate with them. And I know, of course, a number of people in the Chinese virology community, and our virologists also work closely with them. Now, there's nothing strange about this or particular, because that's what science is. It's a global culture. It has always been a global culture. And we've worked around the politicians through the eras. Of course, we don't exchange scientific information on weapons and that sort of information. That's limited to a country. And of course, there's a lot of commercial in confidence as well that nobody breaches. But basically, our relationships with the virology, public health community in China are excellent. And so we were very distressed to see this issue coming up. We do know that China made mistakes early on. That's generally known. Some local authorities tried to shut down their own medical people who were trying to warn them. And the doctor who was most prominent in that and most censured actually died. So that was truly, truly tragic. And they know that. And the Chinese authorities, I think, are embarrassed by that. And also the initial information we had about the virus spreading from a wet market in Wuhan, that was what we all heard at the beginning. It came to us from Ben Cowling, a British epidemiologist who works at Hong Kong University. And Ben related that story, that it seemed to come out of the seafood market, which had the live animal market. And as you probably know, the pangolin was implicated as a possible transition species. These bat viruses go to another species and then to us, it seems. It's a general theme. So that's what we all thought at the beginning. Then we started to see some doubts raised from both China and from some of their European colleagues who were very close to them, that maybe it had come through wildlife, and they'd like to do a lot more wildlife testing. What we did conclude very early on from looking at gene sequence was that, or the virologists concluded, that it doesn't look like a manipulated virus that's been engineered in any way, or like any virus we knew to be in a lab anywhere. It's at least 5 to 10% different from anything we knew about. So it did look as though it had come straight out of nature. I see the Prime Minister who raised this issue, well, I don't think he did, the Foreign Minister did. The Prime Minister is saying now that our own intelligence agencies are telling him that you can't tell the difference between a virus that came out of nature and a virus that was isolated and being worked on in a lab. But as far as they're concerned, the likelihood that it escaped from the lab in Wuhan is down around 5%. And that's directly from Scott Morrison. So I think, regrettably, maybe with a bit of a rush of blood to the head, we bought into a Trump agenda to try and distract away from his own dismal and totally predictable performance with regard to COVID-19. And I don't think we needed to do that. And I think the sooner we back away from it, the better for everyone. And certainly the scientific community throughout this confrontation thing has been absolutely appalled that this happened.
I will just ask now, following on from that, it seems to me that we are currently listening to science and experts after many, many years, particularly in Australia, certainly of ignoring them at best when it comes to the climate change debate. So my question to you, Peter, and then to you, Richard, is do you think that approach of listening to the science and listening to the role of expertise is going to persist with policy challenges like climate change? Or do you think it'll go back to business as usual? And secondly, I guess, should we be preparing for a bit of an onslaught of disinformation and denial once this coronavirus crisis period has passed, do you think?
Well, we're already seeing the onslaught of disinformation and denial, and that always happens. And we're now so accustomed to it, I think. As you know, I've been quite involved in an advocate for the climate scientists. So I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't have that training. But I have written books around this, and particularly the Knowledge Wars back in 2015. And I chaired the Climate Systems Science Centre of Excellence Board for 7 years. So I've talked a lot to these people, and I think they're absolutely terrific and straight. Now, I think recommunication between science and government, I think one of the good things that's coming out of this is we may get better channels of communication. It's been very idiosyncratic. John Howard, for instance, was quite interested in science, and he had a science group that he attended all the time and actually put more money into both medical research and to the Australia Research Council. On the other hand, I think since then, and it's not just the present government, Labor governments as well, not very keyed into science, often not very literate in science, quite frankly. There are very few people in the parliament who are literate in science. But I think we're setting up better channels between the academies, which are the logical people to speak for science, and the chief scientists, and hopefully into politics. So I hope that persists, and we develop much better relationships. and that goes on in the long term. With respect to climate science in particular, and I think Richard's going to be much more useful on this, my great concern is that being dumped in it economically as we have been, there's going to be great pressure to sell more coal and gas. And I noticed one of the Prime Minister's advisor on this wants to sell a lot more gas. Quite frankly, so far as I'm concerned, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, gas is not really much better than coal, but that's another issue. But there have been also a few promising things from within the Parliament. Angus Taylor is, they're putting money into this project in Victoria. Not everyone's favourite in the green world, but I think it's a place to start, of taking either coal gasification or natural gas, splitting the carbon off, burying the carbon sequestering, and making hydrogen. I think that's a good place to start to get a hydrogen economy and a hydrogen export industry going. So I hope they'll keep going down that line. The carbon sequestration from splitting off hydrogen is much easier than from flue gas, which is economically just not feasible. But it comes off much more concentrated in the splitting thing. So, yes, I think, I hope we do. I hope things will change. I hope this is a wake-up call in all sorts of senses about local manufacturing, independence, sustainability, supply chains, and various things. But I'm not holding my breath.
Richard, I'll come to you now. You've been pretty up close and personal with climate politics, certainly over the last decade. Just walk us through, I think, what's on the table at the moment and some of the risks and opportunities in climate policy.
Oh, look, as Peter said, I mean, the risk is that the people that always wanted to build new coal mines and always wanted to drill for more gas, they don't want to waste a crisis. You know, to a man with a hammer, the whole world is a nail. To someone with gas exploration rights, the world is a new opportunity to seek public approval to do something harmful. So we shouldn't be surprised that's where the people who would profit from extracting gas and coal have gone so instantly. I guess the question is of all the ways to create jobs during a crisis like this, is using automated trucks and automated trains to mine coal a very good way to create jobs? No. Is fracking for gas a great way to create jobs? No. So, luckily evidence is on our side here. The question is, the billion-dollar, the trillion-dollar question is, why do governments listen to evidence sometimes and not others? I mean, as Peter's just been explaining, the government in Australia and the government in New Zealand, sure, we've got lots in common, but one's a centre-right government, one's a centre-left government. We're very lucky to live in a country that took climate, that took medical science so seriously in that situation. But New Zealand, on the other hand, Jacinda Ardern announced a moratorium on drilling for oil from opposition before she was elected. Basically said, look, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Why would we be drilling for more oil in a world that needs to burn less fossil fuels? But of course, in Australia, Scott Morrison was elected promising to go and build new coal mines, and now he's berating all the states into drilling for more gas. So I guess my question back to Peter is, Peter, and a bit of a straw poll here, I asked Joe Stiglitz this question last week, so I'm on a roll here of polling Nobel Prize winners. Why do you think we can listen to the science when it comes to this virus, yet in Australia we ignore that science when it comes to renewable energy and coal and gas? We're clearly capable of listening to good science. We're clearly capable of incurring short-term economic pain for long-term public gain. A lot of people think we can't think long-term. This is proof we can. It's worse than that. We've chosen to ignore climate science. What do you think's different, and do you think this is going to change things?
Well, Richard, we generally don't have that much problem getting a decent hearing from the politicians on on medical science and health. I mean, we may think they need to put a bit more funding out there and so forth, but they're generally accepting of that. I mean, everyone wants to be healthy, and they know health is a very popular issue in the general population. So it's not a difficulty. I think on the other hand, that if you really embrace action on climate change, it means not only that a number of vested interests have real problems. I mean, the people who own coal and gas, which is one reason if we could get them to go the hydrogen path, at least for a while, that might be helpful. But it's not just them. It's also the real estate developers in coastal areas. It's all sorts of people who felt threatened by this. And ultimately, it's also us, because we're kind of being asked to change. And that is always very difficult to do when you don't see an immediate reason. Now, being terrified, which is what the virus has done, is an immediate reason. And we're programmed to do that. I mean, human beings are programmed to operate through fight and flight, or flight or fight or whatever, not programmed to deal with things in the long term. Our deep ancestry, if they had an environmental problem, all they did was pick up sticks and move. But now we've got a very large number of people on the planet, and a lot of them living in extremely low-lying areas that are very vulnerable to ocean flooding and so forth. We've got countries that are going to run out of water due to lack of glacier melt. Switzerland is worried they won't have electricity generation because they rely on hydro, and all their glaciers are disappearing fast. And so, as you know, there's an enormous amount of disinformation around this, and it keeps coming out. And anyone who speaks up for it is regarded as a flake, as you know, and you'll be badged in various ways. But the science is robust. A lot of the opposition comes from the idea that, well, you can't trust modelling. Well, basically, when you're measuring the retreat of a glacier, or measuring the extent of damage to the barrier reef, or measuring the temperature of the oceans, or looking at ice retreat in Antarctica, you're not modelling, you're making measurements, and that's pretty direct. So, yeah, the whole crap will come back again, though, you can be sure of it.
Peter, we might go to questions from the audience now, and Richard. There's a couple here touching on the idea of a second wave, and Mark Anderson asks, has all of the extra investment in ICU capacity, ventilators and the like been undertaken as a precaution for a second wave, and is that inevitable? And that's also a question from a couple of other people there. Can you touch on that, please, Peter?
Yes, I think we weren't necessarily thinking of a second wave. We were thinking we would never get it down as far as we did. Because other countries that shut down late didn't. And I think also one of the things that should be said that I missed saying was I think we never had the background infection rates here that they had in Europe and in the USA. We moved very quickly on it due to the fact the Chinese gave out the virus sequence very quickly, which means that we were able to develop a PCR test, which is the test that everybody talks about, very fast. And we picked up our first case, I think, 25th January. And I don't think there was much in the community by then. And then after that, on the whole, we've handled the incoming flights and the cruise ships very well. We made mistakes, but everyone makes mistakes somewhere along the line. So I don't think we had that background infection, but we didn't think we'd get it down so far. And that's the reason, of course, why we built up the hospital space and the ICUs and got in more ventilators and all the rest of it. Now, we are ready for a second wave, but we hope that if it won't be a second wave, that we'll have spot fires and we'll be able to control the spot fires. And if we can do that, our ICU facilities will comfortably handle what will happen. And it would be better to have them underutilised than overutilised, that's for sure. Because as soon as they start to get overutilised, doctors and nurses who are working in those ICU units are at major risk. That's true of all frontline personnel. For instance, I think in London, 24 London bus drivers have died. So yes, we could have a second wave. We hope it won't be. We hope it'll be just spot fires.
Another question for you, probably directly, Peter, is from Chigozie Nachakwu. Apologies, Chigozie, if I've pronounced that incorrectly. They're a postgrad student at the University of New South Wales and asks whether, based on current understanding of COVID-19 immunology, what type of immune or antibody response should a potential vaccine be targeted at? And what are some of the challenges in developing a vaccine when it comes to coronavirus?
The vaccine strategies at the moment are mostly targeted at producing what we call the IgG response, which, as he's asked that question, he'll understand what that means. That as you develop an immune response, what a vaccine does is kind of mimics the immune response caused by an infection, but it either uses just a bit of the virus or an attenuated virus or a killed virus or something of that sort. All those sorts of viruses are out there being developed. And so we think it will go through what we call an IgM response, which is really rather less specific and is actually the basis of a lot of the point of care antibody tests at the moment, which is why a lot of them are not very useful. Then we'll get an IgG response, we expect, after vaccination by about 21, 28 days. We should have a decent antibody response, which hopefully will be protective. And so the other component of the immune response that might be particularly useful to develop in this is a molecule called IgA, which is secreted into the respiratory tract. If we really wanted to develop that, though, we'd probably need to use a vaccine that was maybe some injected, but maybe some puffed down the nose or something of that sort. So I think an IgG response is what we normally get, which is fine in most vaccinations.
Melissa Sweet, I think we've got you there, hopefully. She's a journalist with Croaky News. Might come to you in just a second if you've got a question. But the next question I had there is from Chris Truman, who asks, what do you think about how Sweden has performed? I'm not sure if you've been paying attention to that, Peter. Do you care to comment on that?
Some attention, but not terribly closely. I mean, epi's not really my field, but of course, Sweden kept things pretty open. Swedish population, pretty homogeneous. I mean, even though we hear about problems with immigrants, if you look at it, it's a pretty homogeneous population. We've been to Sweden a lot over the last few years. They all look pretty much Swedish, quite frankly, or Scandinavian. So they're homogeneous, they're extremely well educated, and they're also extremely rational in the way they approach things. They're basically Lutherans to begin with. I think they're all Lutherans at heart, but most of them aren't religious anymore. So I think they've behaved pretty well, but they've had a fair number of cases and people in the hospital, as I recall. There are various models out there. Korea didn't or hasn't shut down to the extent we shut down, I think, but they used an enormous amount of testing to check for community transmission. They're also extremely disciplined. They're all tracked electronically, and they accept that. And they're just a very well organised and high functioning society in many, many respects.
Melissa, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I think so, Ebony.
Did you have a question for the panellists?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, look, I'd be interested to hear, your future casting, what the potential scenarios might be, not only for Australia, but for the world, best case and worst case type of scenarios for in a year's time, in 5 years' time.
Peter, we might go to you first on the future health scenarios, and then Richard, perhaps you can answer that in terms of economic scenarios.
Best case scenario is that the chimp adenovirus vaccine, which is already, I think, in about 500 or 600 people, a British vaccine, and is being produced in at least 60 million doses are currently being produced in India. And they're talking about getting that out into large numbers of people in September. So best hope scenario is that vaccine works. Chinese also, I think, are moving a vaccine on at that sort of pace. And if their vaccine works, great too. We can't really test a vaccine at the moment in Australia in people because we don't have enough infection in the community, because the only way you can test a vaccine against a virus is to first determine that it doesn't look to be unsafe in animals when you challenge them with the virus, and that it does the job of preventing the infection. And then just preliminary testing to see that just giving the vaccine itself doesn't cause some problem in humans. Because the only thing you can do really is vaccinate people and put them out there where the infection is and see how they do. So you progressively escalate up the numbers. This is what essentially was done with the Ebola vaccine in the face of the Ebola outbreak, and that's what we have to do now. So we could have vaccines out there that are working by September, October. The problem will be getting enough product made. I mean, if we find that one of those vaccines looks really good and we want to get it, we're going to have to get it made. So that could be an issue. Worst case scenario is the vaccine doesn't work, proves to be unsafe, doesn't give enough immunity. And also the problem with the vaccine may be, though it may work well in young people, which we could vaccinate all the young people, up, and I'm talking about young up to about age 60. And my age, they look young. And they all make a good immune response. We would massively increase herd immunity, and that would greatly diminish the risk of transmission. But the issue is always with the elderly. Will a vaccine work well in the elderly? We know that flu vaccines don't work particularly well. The flu vaccine that older people like me get is a high-test vaccine with a lot more viral protein in it, and this is funded separately by the Australian government for older people. So we may need a much bigger dose of vaccine or multiple doses of vaccine for the elderly if it's to work at all. And in some it may not work. And so there the alternative would be antiviral drugs, and taken as a preventive, apart from treatment, taken as a preventive, like the HIV PrEP, where you take 2 of the antiviral HIV drugs, which are well proven, ahead of time if you're a person who puts yourself at high risk, and then you won't get AIDS. So we could protect people both with drugs and vaccines. So if the best case scenario is by the end of the year, we would certainly have a substantial number of people vaccinated. We will have drugs to treat the virus infection early, which might massively decrease the severity of symptoms. And we maybe have drugs to even take as preventive. Worst case scenario is none of those things work. Now, the virus itself, will it stick around? Possibly. If it does, I don't think it's going to be a major problem. In fact, I suspect it will be less of a problem than seasonal flu. And that in the long term, if we've got drugs and if we've got a vaccine that if the virus changes can be just tweaked a bit, I think we don't need to fear this virus in the long term at all. But I may be wrong, but that's my view.
And Richard, casting ahead to the future economically, what do you think we're in for?
Well, I mean, best case scenario, as Peter said, we get vaccines soon. We can start to open up not just our domestic economy, but we can open up our economy to inbound tourists, to foreign students. Best case scenario, we have no health reason to keep parts of the economy shut down, and both have to happen. And best case scenario, our government actually takes responsibility for helping to drag the economy out of the deepest recession we've ever had, a recession caused, rightly, but caused by government policy. Worst case scenario, and we know how to do that. We know how to use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. We know how to do it. It's how we got out of the Great Depression. It's how we avoided the recession in 2008. We've listened to the medical science so far. Good. Are we going to listen to the economic science when it comes to getting out of this? Worst case scenario is that the Australian government treats the economic recovery the way Trump has treated the medical crisis. And by that I mean just optimism. Trump has told himself that everything's going to be all right. Unfortunately, 67,000 dead Americans show that was misplaced optimism. Worst case in Australia, the government actually believes this snap back thing. Think about what the metaphor of snap back is. It's as if there's some natural tendency. You pull the economy this way, and then when you let it go, it snaps back, and we wind up where we were. This is not what economics says. This is not what history says. What economics says is we have to grab it and we have to drag it kicking and screaming back into something that is creating millions of jobs for millions of unemployed people. So, yeah, worst case scenario, we're laissez-faire about the economics. It's great that we've been interventionist when it comes to health. It's great. It worked. It gives us options that few countries in the world have. But just because we can lift some restrictions, there's nothing inevitable about economies snapping back. People who've lost their jobs don't spend much in shops. We've got a slow world economy. So our export markets are drying up. We can't bring tourists here. We can't bring foreign students here. Why would businesses go out and invest a lot of new money to build new capacity when our economy is going to be 10% smaller than it was last year? So, yeah, worst case scenario is we get the health bit right and we get the economics wrong. And it took 10 years to recover from the Great Depression, not because it was so deep, but because politicians spent so long ignoring what the economics said they needed to do.
The next question is from Tim Rouse, and Pia Browse, if you can hear me, we'll come to you shortly for your question to the panel live. Tim's question is that 188 organisations have just suggested to the Morrison government that the gaps in the economic safety net, which includes at least 1 million people, including asylum seekers and refugees on temporary visas, that constitutes a weakness in our public health strategy. So are there public health reasons to include excluded categories of residents in the economic safety net, do you think? First to you, Peter.
Well, my answer will be very brief, because one would think there are public health reasons to try and make those people feel comfortable and keep themselves safe. But I think it's really a question for Richard.
Richard?
Look, I think there's economic and health reasons to do it. The government's spending like it's Keynesian, but it's not thinking like it's Keynesian. The government has pumped $130 billion of wage subsidy into the economy. Great. Is it giving it to casual workers that haven't had the same job for 12 months in a row? No. Who are the most affected people by this downturn? Casual workers. Is it giving it to workers on temporary visas? No. Who are the most affected people by this crisis? Those same temporary workers. So we're spending an enormous amount of money, which, sounds good and looks good, and it's better than not spending a lot of money in terms of stimulating demand, but we're not aiming it at the group in the population who both need it the most from an equity point of view, and who will go out and spend it the most, which from an economic point of view is what we need. And apart from being inequitable and apart from being economically inefficient, what we've seen internationally is that when you leave small marginalised groups out of the national response, as guest workers have been in Singapore, you get pockets where people have no choice but to live in tight confines with large numbers of other people and keep going about some of their activity because they need the income. So, yeah, leaving out the most vulnerable workers, unfair, economically inefficient, and potentially from a health point of view, creating a vector for the spread of a disease that's easy to avoid.
Thanks, Richard. Pia, are you there and can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. What's your question for the panel?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. I'm interested in this whole vexed issue of children, whether they spread the virus or not. And my question, I know there's been lots of studies about this, but isn't the reality that you simply can't know the extent of this unless you actually test the children? And it seems that a number of the studies are based on symptoms and not on robust testing. I would just like the panel's view on this.
Thanks, Pia.
It's complex, and I think it's different if we're talking about small children and older children. Small children do seem to be getting less infection, but sometimes they get obvious clinical signs, and we've had some die as well. Not common. I think it certainly, if there's any hint there's virus activity in a school, you would be testing the children because they could take it home. But But the epidemiologists seem satisfied that the school's not a major risk. Honestly, I think the only way we're going to know that is to open up some of the schools gradually and see what happens. I know we've had a couple of schools closed because of teachers getting infected, but I think one teacher got infected at a gig before we shut down that was completely separate from the school. I don't really know the answer. And I know this goes backwards and forwards and everyone's concerned about it. Scientists, of course, we just keep everything shut down forever because that's the science, but economically and socially it's not feasible.
Richard, did you have any response to that?
Look, ask an economist anything, but this one won't answer. I have no idea whether it transmits through kids. I've got 2 kids. The last thing I want to see is them get sick, but at the same time, I want them to get a great education. And, I think Australia, and Ebony referred to this before, the Australian Institute's just done some polling on trust in government. And, frankly, while I've got all sorts of concerns with some of the policy directions for this federal government, I actually trust the process that we've created. I think that the National Cabinet has done a great job, not just for sharing information between states and territories, but making the public feel like there's a lot of eyes on the big decisions and they're being made well, which doesn't mean everyone agrees with all of them. Life's too complicated for that. But, yeah, as an outsider looking in with no scientific capacity to critically evaluate this stuff, I hope the schools open up soon, but I don't think it's a conspiracy to keep them closed. I think good people with good intentions are disagreeing about hard questions, and I'm willing to cut them some slack.
Peter, did you have something to add?
Yes, I mean, if we think that most children, if they get infected, are going to be fairly low-level infection, in general, we know there are a number of people in the community, in the broader community, that do get infected, but they're essentially asymptomatic. They don't develop any symptoms. And that means they're not coughing or spluttering or sneezing, which is what spreads this virus around very much. So we don't know how important they are in transmission. We really just don't understand that. And we do think the virus dose is very important because that's why the ICU doctors and nurses, often younger, get nonetheless very, very severe disease and even die. But there are a lot of questions we haven't answered about this infection. We do know that people who do develop symptoms can be infectious for 24 to 48 hours before. So we do know that. But otherwise, we don't know that much about these particular issues. And you've got to acknowledge we've only known about this virus for several months, and we've already learned an enormous amount. There's still many things we don't understand about how it causes disease, why the disease looks though it looks superficially like flu, why it's so very different.
I think we'll come next to Fiona Stanley, but are you there, Fiona? Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. Hi, Richard. Just to comment on the schools issue, I think Pia's question was absolutely a very good one. There are several reasons why testing in schools, particularly the years 11s and 12s, but also perhaps in uni students as well, is that first of all we reassure the teachers because the infection rates would be very low, and I think the teachers here in Western Australia anyway are feeling like guinea pigs, and the teachers and the parents are worried. We could also then get the kids who tested positive to self-isolate. We could say to teachers who've got disease or old parents that they're looking after not to teach, but it would give us a sense about community transmission. And I think that's what we're now doing in WA with the Telethon Kids Institute, is actually doing a study where we're actually, it's quite big and it's quite political, but we're going to look at that level of infection in the schools. And I think that's it's going to be a survey as well as looking at other groups, so it'll be quite a decent survey. But I don't know why people haven't thought of that before. I mean, it's something that's so obvious that if you want to find out about it, then test.
Yeah, that's a good point. How important is testing, Peter?
Look, I mean, Fiona is the best person to speak on this. If anyone doesn't know Fiona, she is both a paediatrician and an epidemiologist. I'll just say something about the test. The test is what we call the PCR test. It's the same test we use to detect small amounts of genetic material in a rape case. So it amplifies up genetic material. It doesn't detect an infectious virus. And that's where a lot of confusion has been, because we can get genetic material still being shed in a person for some time after they're essentially better. And they kind of test positive by this test. So what we don't know is how much infectious virus people are putting out. We just have the PCR results. And so that's a limitation. But if you do enough testing and you're finding positives and you correlate that with transmission, obviously that's going to answer it. So exactly what Fiona said is the way to resolve this issue.
Thank you for that, Fiona, and we might follow up with an invitation to you for you to be a panellist at a future one, if that's okay. And we greatly appreciate that you've come along to a couple of our webinars now, and thank you for your input there. We've only got a couple of minutes to go here. Peter, is there anything that you'd like to say to wrap up? What would your message be to everyone today?
Well, my message is generally, until we have a good vaccine out there or good drug treatments that make sure people don't die, both for your own sake and for the sakes of others, particularly older people like me who are in the firing zone, if you like, or the zone where you might be fired, that just keep in mind what we've been doing. Social distancing, being careful. If you get a cough or a fever, get yourself tested and isolate yourself till you get the results. The test doesn't take more than 24 hours. So if it's slower than that, it's due to reporting, not to the lab. So basically, just stay careful, stay aware and conscious of what you're doing. And I think that'll help us all get through it as basically these controls are lifted. And of course, we do understand that if it really did blow up again, as it did in Japan, for instance, we would have to close down again. And that would be an enormous economic impost and a social impost as well, because we've been accustomed to one thing, we're flipping back again. We don't want to be going backwards and forwards, obviously.
And just finally, we've got a couple of people who I'm guessing follow you on Twitter wanting to know, did you get what you needed from Dan Murphy's the other day?
Yeah. I was using Microsoft Outlook and I had Twitter open and I put in what I thought was Google. I put in, when does Dan Murphy's open? And it was in Twitter. So that earned me quite a loss of reputation, which was good, because everyone thinks that anyone with the title professor is a Nobel Prize winner. It has to be an absolute stiff. So I hope I diffused that a bit. I'm as silly as anybody else. And basically it earned me 8,000 more Twitter followers. But due to the advice I received on Twitter, I ordered online from Dan Murphy's, and that was perfectly satisfactory.
Oh, well, pleased to hear it. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Doherty and Richard. And thank you, Fiona Stanley, for your contribution as well.
You can check out the Australia Institute's Economic of a Pandemic webinar series at our website. That's tai.org.au/webinars. For the latest health information, you can check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent Coronacast podcast, which comes out daily. The Australia Institute is on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Professor Doherty is at Prof. PC Doherty, and Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy with production help from Jack Wellner and Holly Forrest, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum. Stay home, and thanks for listening.